Aging and disease are biochemical processes that happen over many decades. And if we track well-established biomarkers of organ and systemic health, can aging and disease risk be slowed? So that's my central premise. And with that in mind, last month, I blood tested for the 4th time in 2022. So what's my biological age? So using Dr. Morgan Levine's biological age calculator, which is known as phenotypic age, and when entering its 9 component biomarkers and chronological age, we can see that my biological age using Levine's test is 32.6, and that's 16.8 years younger than my chronological. So note that these blood tests were performed by Quest, by the lab Quest. So their high sensitivity C-reactive protein measurement was less than 0.3 milligrams per liter on the lab report. So CRP could be anywhere from 0 to 0.3. So I entered the upper limit of that 0.3. Now, note that in contrast to venipuncture, which is what Quest, that's what is performed generally at every lab. In contrast with that, at-home blood biomarker testing may be the next frontier for attempting to slow aging. So why is that? Well, you don't need to go to the lab. You can just prick your finger at home whenever you want. And why that's beneficial is because you can prick a different finger every day. So, for example, I have up to 38 blood tests since 2015, so about an average of about 5 tests per year through venipuncture. In contrast, I could get 40 blood tests theoretically by pricking a different finger every day in 6 weeks instead of 7 years. So one can get closer to biomarker optimization much faster with at-home blood biomarker testing. So with that in mind, I got a kit from a company. I'm not sponsored by them, so I won't indicate who it was, but this is an at-home dry blood spot test. So you basically just prick your finger, you put it on a card, and you mail it off, and they tell you the results 1 or 2 days later. So I got the at-home dry blood spot test for HSCRP. And so then the big question is at-home testing as good as the gold standard, which is venipuncture? And note that the lab test, the in-person lab test was at about 7:30 in the morning fasted. So when I got home, I also then did the finger prick test. So the finger prick test is about an hour later, still fasted. So then to answer the question, was high sensitivity C-reactive protein less than 0.3 milligrams per liter? And that's an important question because if it's higher, then it's probably not a reliable test. But if it's lower, that suggests that it could be as good as venipuncture, which is good news. So here's their lab report from the at-home test for HSCRP, and we can see that actually the sensitivity of their test is a little bit better than the in-person venipuncture test. So the upper limit of their sensitivity is 0.2 milligrams per liter. So and my data was less than 0.2 milligrams per liter. So it would appear that this at-home test is as good as venipuncture for at least detecting HSCRP. I can't guarantee that for other at-home dried blood spot tests, but at least for HSCRP, that's good news. So to answer the question, was HSCRP less than 0.3 milligrams per liter? We can give it a resounding yes. And then we can return to Levine's test data. And instead of 0.3 milligrams per liter, we can put the upper limit for the at-home test, 0.2. And when I do that, my biological age is then 32.2 for this test, which is 17 years younger than my chronological of 49.4. So how did these data compare with earlier tests? It may be relatively easy to quote unquote biohack one test, but what's the bigger picture? What's my biological age over many tests, over many years? So for more context, let's have a look at biological age results since 2020. And that's what we can see here, Levine's biological age on the y-axis plotted against time. So in 2020, I blood tested 6 times, and using Levine's test and entering my biomarker data, I get an average age of 35.6 years. Similarly, also 35.6 years in 2021 over 6 tests. And then over 4 tests, the first 4 tests in 2022, I plan on measuring at least 3 more times. We can see that my average is 33.9 years. So I'm off to a good start in terms of lowering it. Now, I don't think I can lower it much further than where it is now. Once you get your biomarker values to youthful levels, then the key is just maintaining them for as long as possible. So now, as another way of looking at this, note that prior to 2022, my average biological age reduction relative to my chronological age was about 12 years, and that's over 15 tests. So from 2018 to 2019, I also blood tested 3 times. So plus the 12 blood tests in 2020 and 2021, that's 15 tests. So my average chronological age minus biological age, about 12 years over those 15 tests. But so far in 2022, I've further reduced that such that my average reduction per test is 15.2 years, so a further 3-year reduction. Now, note that phenoage, while I'm a big fan of it, don't get me wrong, I'm not here to knock it by any means. While it includes chronological age in its model, which limits the maximum biological age reduction. And that's important because if I maintain these biomarkers indefinitely, let's say when I'm 80 years old and nothing has changed except for my chronological age, what's built into this metric is even with these same biomarker values, my biological age at the age of 80 will be 59. So to me, that doesn't seem right. If your biochemistry is the same, you shouldn't be at most 20 years younger. So it's a limitation of the training set that they use. They probably didn't have super healthy, fit people in there. Not that I'm saying I am, but anyway, that's a limitation of the model. So anyway, in contrast, aging.ai does not include chronological age in its model, so greater reductions for biological age are possible. So then what's my aging.ai blood test? What's my biological age using aging.ai? So my aging.ai 3.0, again, free to use like Levine's test. You can put your own data in at aging.ai, and I'm not sponsored by either of these companies. I'm just grateful they exist so that I can calculate these my biological age using these metrics. So when entering the 19 component biomarkers as shown there on the July 11th, 2022 test, I get a biological age of 28, which is 21.4 years younger than my chronological. Now, data for one blood test is good, but just like we did for Levine's test, let's look at more data to get more context to see how I'm doing. So I have a lot more data that can compute aging.ai biological age. The difference is that all of these biomarkers are found on the standard chem panel, the lipid panel, and the CBC, which is basically a standard physical that you get at a yearly checkup with your doctor, at least here in the United States. So on Levine's test, it requires HSCRP. That's like an add-on extra test that you've got to pay extra for. So I wasn't doing that way back when in 2009. But I did have at least basic data from my yearly physical with my doctor starting in 2009. So starting from 2009 and 2013, I was only measuring at most once a year, and I have 3 blood test points over that 5-year span or 4-year span, and my average aging.ai age was 32. And then in 2016, I decided to start testing more often to try to get a more reflective overview of how my biological age looked, and more specifically, how all of the component biomarkers. I'm not married to the cutesy number of a biological age. I want all of these component biomarkers to be youthful for as long as possible. So in 2016 to 2021, I then tested 27 times, and over those 27 tests, my average aging.ai age was just a tick under 30, 29.9 years. So what about in 2022? So we can see that there, and after 4 tests, I've further reduced it to 28.5 years. Now, just as I mentioned for Levine's test, I don't think I can further reduce it beyond this range. I mean, I'm confident that I can keep it around 30, a little below, almost indefinitely, or that's the hope. So then the bigger question is, how long can I resist these age-related biomarker changes? Will I be 80, 90, 100 and beyond with the biochemistry of a 30-year-old? We'll see. So what's contributing to these biological age reductions? Am I taking geroprotectors or senolytics? What's my diet? So in terms of what's contributing to these data, let's just take a look at supplements. So I was diagnosed with hypothyroidism in my mid-20s. So I've been taking levothyroxine. I'm currently taking 137.5 micrograms per day, and I've been doing that for probably half my life. And then I take vitamin D probably about 8 or 9 months of the year. I live in Boston, so for 8 or 9 months of the year here, I'm not getting adequate sun exposure. So I take 1,000 IUs per day, but for some of the portion of this blood test for the 63-day period that corresponds to this blood test, I didn't take it. So probably 80%, if 80% of the days I took vitamin D, for this blood test. And then I do take occasional melatonin either before bed or in the middle of the night, but you can see this isn't a lot. This is only about 39 micrograms per day, not milligrams. So it's just, it's a fraction of a milligram. So very small amounts when I feel like I need to get better sleep. And that's it. No other supplements, no geroprotectors or senolytics. I have taken methyl B12 in the past, but for a few blood tests, at least in 2022, I stopped taking it. And if anyone's curious, I can answer that, after the presentation. All right, so then what about diet? How's diet, or how might diet contribute to these data? So you can see that my blood test was on July 11th, but that doesn't tell us anything about how diet may correspond. So the average daily dietary intake from my last blood test on May 9th to the day before this blood test on July 10th corresponds to blood test number 4 in 2022. So how am I tracking diet? How am I doing that? So in taking a look at the calendar, because it's easier to illustrate, here we can see May, June, and July. And then as I mentioned, I blood tested on May 9th. That was blood test number 3. And then test number 4 on July 11th. So in between are 63 days in between tests. And that's what corresponds to blood test number 4. The average intake for those 63 days corresponds to test number 4. And so every day since April of 2015, I've weighed all my food. And then I've entered those food amounts into Chronometer. It's an online tracking app. I'm not here to say they're the best. There are others that one can use, but that's what I've used since 2015. And then I enter the daily Chronometer data into a spreadsheet, my own personal spreadsheet, just an Excel spreadsheet, nothing special. And then I compute the average intake for those 63 days. And then I line that up with the blood test data, blood test number 4. And then since every blood test has a corresponding diet composition or an average corresponding diet composition, with enough data for both blood biomarkers and diet, I can investigate correlations, and then based on the correlations, I can modify my diet or even supplements for one, if that's what one wants to do. I can modify those with the goal of optimizing the blood biomarkers. So in a sense, not only am I optimizing blood biomarkers, this is kind of a precision nutrition approach. So I'm covering basically both bases. So let's first start off by looking at the individual food amounts, or at least some of the individual food amounts that corresponded to this blood test. So I've got the first 23 foods listed here. And this again is for the 63-day period that corresponded to the latest blood test, amount in grams at the top, and then ranked based on the highest intake to the lowest intake. So why are these foods at the top? Why have I chosen to include these foods? So by tracking diet in conjunction with blood biomarkers, I can focus on eating foods that have positive correlative scores with the blood biomarkers while minimizing intake for foods with negative scores. So for that, let's take a look at correlations for strawberry intake with what I've come to define as big picture biomarkers. Now, note that this is right now it's about 24 blood biomarkers, and I have plans to expand it on upcoming tests and bridging out into hormones like DHEA. So it's a constantly expanding panel of big picture biomarkers. And note that although I've tracked macros and micros since 2015, I only started tracking individual food amounts since 2018. So in other words, I have less tests, so I have up to 23 blood tests that correspond to diet, in contrast with macros and micros, where I have a lot more data, up to 38 blood tests. All right, so here are the big picture biomarkers, and just to run through them, they include obviously things like glucose, which in my opinion should be on any panel aimed at optimizing or slowing aging. Homocysteine, which I haven't given it its own category yet, but I've grouped it with glucose just for now. 3 markers of kidney function, 3 markers of liver function, all the major lipoproteins, immune-related cells, and a protein, globulin. Red blood cell related measures, a marker of inflammation, high sensitivity C-reactive protein, and then the overall biological age score using PhenoAge and aging.ai. So just further introduces the little n next to each blood test is how many blood tests that I had that correspond to that biomarker. The R at the top left is the correlation. And the p-value is the measure of statistical significance, with less than 0.05 being statistically significant. All right, so what's significantly associated with strawberry intake? So a relatively higher strawberry intake is significantly associated with a lower level of the liver enzyme AST, lower LDL, lower levels of platelets, and a lower high sensitivity C-reactive protein. So once there are significant correlations, the next step is identifying whether the significant correlations are going in the right or wrong direction in terms of aging and or all-cause mortality risk. And I don't have time to go into that in this video, but I have plenty of those videos on my YouTube channel. So if you're interested in that, check it out, or we can talk about it after the presentation. But just to go through it real quick, for something like AST, even just using the reference range, I've had data that's been higher than the reference range, and somewhere around 20 is optimal based on all-cause mortality data. So since this is an inverse association that suggests higher strawberry intake is correlated with lower AST in the right direction, so I've given it a green arrow. So green arrows will be going in the. So for that, you can see that there are 4 green arrows, and that gives me a net correlative score of +4. So what does that mean? If the net score was negative, that would indicate that I should eat below my average intake. If the net score was 0, I would eat at my average intake. And if the net score was positive, I should eat above my average intake. So my average strawberry intake since 2018 is 350 grams per day. We can see that for this test, I averaged 622 grams. So I'm following that correlation. So we give it a green check. So let's do another example, red bell peppers. So here we'll take a look at correlations for red bell peppers with these big picture biomarkers. So we can see that red bell pepper intake is significantly correlated with higher creatinine, with higher neutrophils, and then a lower lymphocyte percentage. And you can see I've given these all red arrows because they're going in the wrong direction. Similarly, neutrophils increase during aging, and the lymphocyte percentage declines during aging. So those are going in the wrong direction in terms of their correlation with red bell pepper intake. So 3 red arrows, we can see that the net score is -3. When the net score is negative, that suggests I should eat below my average intake. My average daily red bell pepper intake since 2018 is 298 grams per day. And we can see that I purposefully ate below that. Red is indicative of it's going in the wrong direction. So for example, a relatively higher carrot intake is significantly correlated with lower homocysteine. So that would be going in the right direction because homocysteine increases during aging. And relatively higher levels are associated with an increased all-cause mortality risk. So my average intake since 2018 is 372 grams. I should be eating above that based on the positive net score, but we can see that I'm not. So that we give that a red X. And there's a little bit more depth to that story. Part of it involves beta carotene. So if anybody's curious, I can answer questions about that later. So why I haven't gone above 372 for carrots. All right, so mushrooms have a net score of +4, significantly correlated with lower levels of alkaline phosphatase, AST, CRP, LDL, and platelets, but a higher homocysteine. So 5 going in the right direction, 1 in the wrong gives it the net score of +4. So prior to 2018, I was eating lots of mushrooms, but I took them out until relatively recently. So we can see that my average intake isn't very high. So it was easy to eat above them for this test, 231 grams per day. So red arrow, green check, because I'm following the correlations. Next up are beets, and I'm not a fan of the term superfoods, but we can see that beets, for whatever reason, in my data have a net score of +8, with 8 biomarkers going in the right direction and none in the wrong, including a lower overall aging.ai age, lower AST, lower creatinine, glucose, LDL, neutrophils, and platelets. We can see inverse correlations for all those, but a higher lymphocyte percentage. And remember, lymphocyte percentage declines during aging. So my average intake for beets is 115 grams per day, and we can see that 206 is greater than 115, so I follow the correlation there. Next up, collard greens, and net score of +1. It's significantly correlated with lower LDL. And I've recently switched from spinach. I was eating a lot of spinach basically forever, and I recently switched because oxalates in my data have a very negative overall score. Collard greens are very low in oxalates by comparison, so I recently switched. That's why you can see my average intake of collard greens is very low, and it was easy to eat above that for this test. And then last on this list is watermelon, net score of +5, which suggests I should eat above my average intake of 152. And I did that for this test with an intake of 200 grams per day. All right, so as I mentioned, by following the correlations for as many foods and macros and micros, I also use this approach for all the macros and micronutrients as possible. I expect that my best biomarker profile will result. So what about the rest of the diet, including macros and micros? And I don't have time to go into it in this presentation, but I have lots of YouTube videos on that on my channel, and you can check it out there. So with that, I'm ready for questions.
All right, thank you very much, Michael. Yeah, we've got several questions coming in. So regarding biomarkers of aging, I've got one, but here's one from our audience. Do you measure your photo age? There are apps for that. Would your photo age be non-increasing as your epigenetic age or blood age?
Yeah,
and you look great, by the way. So I think it is holding steady.
Thanks, Oliver. I haven't done photo age yet. I think a lot of things can probably impact it, like lighting and sleep, that I get enough sleep on that day. But it gets into the bigger question of skin aging, right? Is how do you optimize skin aging? And I think that probably is the hardest thing to optimize. You can take someone that's 100 years old and maybe optimize their biochemistry and many other organ systems, but their skin will still look old. So that's on the to-do list and figuring that out.
Okay. Another question is, you show no consumption of alcoholic beverages or other recreational drugs. Wines in particular have been suggested as health enhancers. Do you see nothing but harm from consuming them?
Yeah, so that's a tricky thing because I wear a fitness tracker and I track my heart rate variability and resting heart rate. These are metrics of cardiovascular fitness. And there's a ton of data on alcohol messing up cardiovascular metrics. So I already have some issues with sleep, or I should say I'm always, so that's answer number one. Answer number two is I've read or heard anecdotally, or both, that alcohol can mess with sleep quality in terms of increasing light sleep while taking away from REM and slow wave sleep. And I'm constantly trying to optimize my sleep. So that would work against me if I was drinking even a small amount of alcohol. So, and then, it's not, alcohol is not nutrient dense. The whole food is, grapes. So one can make an argument that I should maybe include grapes in my approach rather than the processed version of the whole food. So fourth, by looking, I hate to say scoreboard and look at the blood biomarkers, but how would you further improve that? What would you expect that alcohol would further improve in my biomarker data? If it isn't going to improve my CV metrics, if it isn't going to improve the blood biomarkers, I don't see a need. So that said, this is the approach for me. Now, for others, they may have different experiences with alcohol where it improves their blood biomarkers, or it doesn't affect their sleep, or whatever the case may be. But I'd encourage objective metric tracking, so that they can see, rather than taking it based on some epidemiological or some RCT, does it actually improve some objective measures of health at the individual level? So,
and you've got a lot of blood-based markers, obviously, that you're looking at, but have you been correlating them with or performing other types of kind of more easily accessible physiologic-based markers on yourself, such as gait or cognitive testing or lung volume, for example? Have you been doing that?
Yeah, not lung volume yet, but in terms of the physical function measures, as I mentioned, I'm tracking the CV metrics, and I hate to say my CV metrics have never been better, but I basically had a PR personal record this morning for heart rate variability and resting heart rate. So I'm on the right track there. My workouts are standardized. You hear the thing, switch up your workouts. Well, I don't do that. My workouts are standardized. I know exactly how many sets and reps and how much weight I'm doing, workout to workout, week to week, year to year. So I know if my strength is going to decline because I have these things standardized. So since I've been doing that over the past 3 or 4 years, there's no decrement in strength at all. At worst, I've maintained strength. FEV in terms of lung volume is a great measure. That's on the to-do list, but I have expanded it into other things like the oral microbiome. I think that maybe, the blood biomarker metrics may miss changes in the oral microbiome. And you could have microbes in the mouth that may be associated with, plaque formation or Alzheimer's disease. So I've recently gotten into quantifying that and then trying to optimize that. So it's a constantly expanding approach, but trying to include as many things as possible. I don't want to get to 80, 90, 100 and realize that I missed something that I should have been tracking.
Okay, I think I have one more question. I remember this from a talk you gave a while back. I think it may have been even a live conference when we did that pre-COVID. You mentioned that I think one of the more important markers that you had was albumin levels. Is that would you like to maybe talk just to make a few comments on that, if that's how relevant that is, or has that changed as this based on data that you've later collected?
Yeah, so albumin is still very important, not just its inclusion on these 2 biological age calculators, not just because of that, but in terms of the concentration of the protein that's the most abundant in blood, it's albumin. And its levels decline during aging, and relatively low levels are associated with an increased all-cause mortality risk. So, and there's plenty of data too linking relatively low levels of albumin with decreased physical function, just as an example. So yeah, my albumin levels are still high and youthful, but I've learned that, even based on what's youthful and what's associated with lowest all-cause mortality risk, higher is not necessarily better. And in fact, in my data, I've had values as high as, 5.2, 5.3, 5.4. And even though that's still within the reference range, when I do a biomarker versus biomarker analysis, in other words, albumin versus the quote unquote big picture biomarkers. So how well does that fit into the context of the broader systemic health? There is too high, there can be too high even within the reference range. So with that in mind, I've tried to focus it more narrowly around 4.8, 4.9 and try to limit the times on 5.1, 5.2, 5.3, 5.4. And so far, so good with that. But yeah, albumin is still super important. Beta carotene is still very strongly correlated with albumin in my data. However, I should mention I've seen people where that's true. People that I work with, that I'm tracking, helping them track their data, where they also have correlations with albumin for beta carotene, but then others that don't have that correlation in their data. So I can't say that everybody go eat more carrots, you'll have higher albumin. Actually, they've actually got to measure and try to identify the factors that may impact it for them.